how do you think the hot wars, by that I mean Ukraine and Gaza, have affected the overall strategy? I mean, did those wars or conflicts or whatever you want to call them sort of fit into what was anticipated as a national security or world international strategy, or are they kind of anomalies that we now have to adjust to? Because for one thing, I was thinking about Ukraine. People have been referring to it as kind of like a World War I situation, and an incredible amount of ordnance has been spent there. A lot of money that we weren't really thinking of as like a ground war in Europe. Now we're not fighting it ourselves, but it certainly has required a great deal of financial commitment. So, what are the thoughts at the Pentagon about how that may? And we don't know where the Gaza situation is going, but does that require some basic rethinking?
Well, to some extent, but the Ukraine war happens to be the actual version of a possible war against Russia that we were already planning for ourselves and thought that we might have to fight with our own combat forces. And of course, we're not, and we haven't had to, and we don't expect to. And if heaven forbid, if we ever did, because obviously you have all sorts of risks of nuclear escalation. But in a sense, therefore, we are fighting the one war that we planned against, except we're not the ones engaged in the actual shooting. We're doing the logistics support, or a lot of it, and we're providing, as you say, the weaponry. But it's dramatically easier task for us than if we were directly fighting the Russians. And we'll see where this war goes next. May not prove successful, but I would say it's testing the logistics part of our military capacity. It's testing the reconnaissance and intelligence part. And of course, it's testing the defense industrial base. And on that point, let me underscore that without trying to sound, I hope, too callous about what's going on, we are benefiting from the Ukraine war because we're learning. We're learning how much we had allowed our defense industrial base to whittle down to its sort of minimalist size for the kind of military that we wanted, more or less peacetime military. And of course, we're rarely truly at peace as a United States. We fought ISIS very hard, for example, from 2014 through 2019, but almost entirely with air power and special forces and partners on the ground. And so in that period of time, we used certain munitions a lot, certain spare parts a lot, and we tried to replenish them. But there were other kinds of weapons that we were not as good at being able to replenish. And our concerns that, Tori, you mentioned earlier about the waste, fraud, and abuse of earlier periods of defense contracting led us to take a sort of free market approach towards letting the defense industry find efficient mergers and acquisitions and minimize the size of production lines, minimize the ramp-up capacity, because that costs extra money that's not delivering any obvious benefit in peacetime. And so we sort of, in a way, put the squeeze on our defense industrial base too much. And I would say, if anything, again, out of fear of waste, fraud, and abuse and scandal, we then tried to avoid doing things like, let's say, give Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman a couple $100 million a year in subsidies to have excess capacity to keep alive a subcontractor base, even if we didn't think we needed a particular weapon that year or the next year. And now, lo and behold, and I'll finish on this point, we're asking Australia to provide us a couple $2 billion a year in pure subsidies for the submarine shipbuilding industry, as we now promise Australia 8 submarines over the next 2 decades, but don't think we have the capacity to build those submarines while also building enough for our own Navy, which is shorthanded submarine-wise as it is. So in that sense, I think we're going to have to strengthen the defense industrial base, sometimes even through direct subsidies. And that is a lesson coming out of the Ukraine war that we're benefiting from learning now before we might have to learn it at an even more perilous time for the country.